The morning Edith Bancroft climbed onto a stranger's roof, she had already been told 3 times that week she ought to find herself a husband instead of a hammer. She was not looking for a husband. She was looking for loose shingles and a cracked flashing seal around the chimney stack, because the cold was coming in fast across the Kansas plains in October of 1878, and a cold hearth was something she simply would not tolerate. Not after everything she had survived. Not after Thomas. Edith had been a widow for 14 months. 14 months of learning that the world expected a woman alone to either crumble or disappear, and she had done neither. She had 32 years behind her, a son named Calvin who was 9 years old and fierce as a prairie wind, a homestead on the western edge of Harlan County that she had worked with her own hands since Thomas Bancroft died of a fever that came on fast and left faster, taking him with it on a Tuesday morning in August of 1877. She was 5'4" with brown hair the color of good saddle leather, pulled back hard against her neck in a practical bun she had no patience to fuss with. Her hands were calloused. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were the particular shade of dark gray that people sometimes described as stormy, though she would have called them simply tired. The reason she was on a stranger's roof instead of her own was a matter of accident, which was how most of the consequential things in Edith Bancroft's life had arrived. It began 3 days before with a conversation in Harlan's single dry goods store, run by a broad woman named Martha Reeves who knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves. Edith had come in for flour, lamp oil, and a length of rope, and Martha had leaned across the counter and mentioned almost as an aside that old Tom Finley's place had sat empty 6 months now since he moved in with his daughter in Wichita. And wasn't it a shame because the property was good land, and the house was solid framing even if the chimney was falling to ruin from neglect? Edith had not thought much about it in the store. She had paid for her goods and walked out into the dry October wind with Calvin pulling at her sleeve asking about peppermint sticks, which she bought him because she was practical but not heartless. What changed things was the ride home, when she cut across the eastern edge of Finley's old property to save time, and she saw the house sitting there in the late afternoon gold like something waiting to be remembered. It was a good house. 2 rooms proper, a solid porch, a barn that leaned but did not fall, and there was something about the chimney that caught her eye even from a distance. The way the cap sat crooked and the mortar between the stones was visibly crumbling from 20 yards off. She pulled up her mare, a sensible roan named Clover, and looked at it for a long moment. Then she thought, I could fix that, not because she had any claim to the property. Not because anyone had asked her. She thought it the way she thought most useful things, which was directly and without ceremony. She was good with mortar work. Thomas had taught her. She had the tools. And there was something in the idea of fixing a thing that had been left broken that spoke to some deep part of her that the 14 months of widowhood had made very loud. The next morning she loaded the back of her wagon with her mortar tools, a bucket, a length of good rope, and the rubber-soled boots she wore for any work that required sure footing. She dropped Calvin with her neighbor, a stout and cheerful Mennonite woman named Agnes Scull, who took the boy in as naturally as breathing and fed him enough biscuits that he always came home happy and slightly dazed. She drove out to the Finley place. What she had not known, what Martha Reeves had either not mentioned or had not known herself, was that the Finley property had been sold 3 weeks prior. Emmett Winslow had come to Harlan County from northern Missouri, which was far enough away that nobody knew him and close enough that he was not considered entirely foreign. He was 36 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way that came from actual work rather than performance, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried 3 days of stubble as a general condition rather than an affectation. He had a quiet that was not unfriendly but was not immediately welcoming either, the kind of quiet that came from a man who had learned to be careful with himself. He had bought the Finley place for the land more than the house, though he intended to live in the house. He had come west with the particular and serious purpose of a man who has decided to begin again, and means to do it properly. He had a past that was his own business, a little money saved from 4 years of honest ranch work in Missouri, and a very strong opinion about what he wanted his life to look like from this point forward, which was quieter than it had been and more his own. He had been on the property for 11 days when he woke on the morning of the 15th of October to the sound of something scraping on his roof. He came out of his cot with a hand already reaching for the rifle he kept beside it, which was simply sense in 1878 Kansas and not a sign of nervousness, and he stepped out the front door in his boots and his shirt untucked and his suspenders still hanging loose at his sides, squinting up into the hard morning light. There was a woman on his roof. She was crouched near the chimney stack with a bucket beside her and a trowel in her hand, and a rope tied around her waist that disappeared over the ridge of the roof, presumably anchored somewhere on the far side. She was wearing a practical gray dress with the skirt hitched up enough to allow movement and rubber-soled boots, and she was applying mortar to the base of his chimney with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work before and had no time to waste. Emmett Winslow stood at the base of his own house and looked up at her. He was briefly, without any words at all. Then he found some. "Come down from there," he said. She did not look up from her work. "The south face is worse than I thought," she said, as though this were a conversation they had already been having for some time. "The flashing has pulled away from the stone in 2 places. I am going to need another 20 minutes at least." "Come down," he said again. He was not shouting. He was a man who did not shout as a general rule, but there was an edge to it that he thought was reasonable given the circumstances, which were that an unknown woman was crouched on his roof performing repairs he had not asked for. She looked down at him then, and he got his first proper look at her face. The dark gray eyes. The jaw that was set in a way that suggested his opinion on whether she should come down had been noted and filed somewhere low on her list of relevant concerns. "I can come down," she said, "when the chimney is patched. Or you can come up and see for yourself what I am working on, and then you can decide whether you want me to stop." He looked at her. She looked at him. "Come up," she said, not as an invitation exactly, but as a statement of what was possible. Emmett Winslow had not climbed onto the roof of his own house yet. He had been meaning to assess the chimney himself and had simply not gotten there. He put his rifle just inside the door, buckled his suspenders, and walked around the side of the house to where a ladder was propped against the eave with a confidence that suggested it had been placed there by someone who knew what she was doing. He went up. The view from the roof of the Finley place was considerable. The plains opened in every direction, gold and brown and immense, with the October sky pressing down blue and cold above it. The cottonwoods along the creek to the east had gone to yellow. A hawk was working a thermal to the south. But what struck him more immediately was the chimney, because once he was up here and close to it, he could see exactly what she had seen from the road. The mortar between the upper courses of stone was crumbled and missing in long sections. The flashing around the base of the stack where it met the roof had lifted and pulled away on 2 sides, which meant every rain was running down between the stone and the roof boards. He would have had water damage inside the walls before the first real winter storm. "The cap was loose too," the woman said, without looking at him, her trowel moving in smooth practice strokes. "I reset it with fresh mortar about 15 minutes ago. It needs to cure before you use the firebox." "Who are you?" Emmett said. "Edith Bancroft," she said. "My homestead is about 2 miles east of here past the Skull Farm. I was under the impression this property was still empty. I bought it 3 weeks ago." "I know that now," she said. "Did you break into my house?" "I used the ladder from your barn," she said. "The barn door was open. I did not go inside your house." He looked at her for a moment. She was perhaps 30, he thought, though the sun and the work made precise guessing difficult. There was something in the way she moved that was entirely competent, not showy about it, just competent, the way a craftsman's hands move when they know the work. You came out here on your own to repair a chimney on a property you believed was abandoned, he said. Yes. Why? She paused in her work for just a moment and looked out at the plains. Because it needed doing, she said. And I was capable of doing it. She turned back to the mortar. Those are generally sufficient reasons. He sat down on the ridge of the roof, which was wide enough to do safely, and watched her work. He was not sure what else to do. Sending her down now would mean stopping work that was clearly necessary and clearly being done with skill, and he was not the kind of man who wasted either. So he sat and watched the hawk circle and listened to the soft scrape of her trowel. You know chimney work, he said. My husband taught me. He believed a person ought to know how to maintain what they owned. A pause. He died 14 months ago. I am sorry, Emmett said. He meant it, which she seemed to recognize because something in her shoulders, barely perceptible, acknowledged the sincerity of it. Thomas was a good man, she said. Fever took him fast. That is both the mercy and the cruelty of it. She smoothed a long section of mortar with the side of the trowel. I have a son, Calvin. He is 9. That is a good age, Emmett said, though he was not entirely sure what he meant by that. He is also in possession of strong opinions about everything, she said, and there was something in her voice when she spoke about her son that was different from the rest of her voice. Softer, though not less steady. He wants to be a cattle driver. Last week he wanted to be a dentist. I have learned to wait and see. Emmett almost smiled. It was a near thing. Where did you come from? She asked, not looking at him. Northern Missouri, Buchanan County. I worked a cattle ranch there for 4 years. Why Harlan County? He considered the question. Felt like the right distance, he said. She did look at him then briefly, with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what that meant, which surprised him. Yes, she said simply, and went back to the mortar. When she was done, she washed her hands with the water she had brought in a canteen, dried them on a cloth she pulled from her apron pocket, and began to coil the rope with the systematic efficiency of a person who believed in putting things back in their proper order. Emmett climbed down first and stood at the base of the ladder, and without making a ceremony of it, he held the ladder steady while she descended, because the rungs were old and the ground was uneven, and that was simply what you did. When she was standing on the ground again, she was slightly shorter than he had estimated from above. She looked up at him with those gray eyes and then at her wagon, which was parked beside the barn. The mortar needs 48 hours to cure fully before you light the firebox, she said. There is a hairline crack on the north side of the second course from the top that I could not get to today. You will want to address it before heavy rain. I appreciate the work, he said. And then, because he had been raised with certain courtesies and he did not intend to discard them entirely just because he had come west, can I offer you coffee? I have a pot on. She looked at him. He felt the weight of the assessment and stood in it because there was nothing to hide from it. Yes, she said. Thank you. The inside of the Finley house was sparse but not uncomfortable. Emmett had a cot along one wall, a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove with a cast iron pot on it, and a row of wooden crates serving as shelving until he built something proper. A saddle was draped over a sawbuck in the corner. 3 books were stacked on one of the crates with the deliberateness of things that had been carried some distance. Edith sat at the table and accepted the coffee in a tin cup and drank it without adding anything to it, which he noted and respected. You intend to farm here? She asked. Cattle, he said. I have 8 head coming up from a contact in Sumner County at the end of the month. I will expand from there. The south pasture floods in a heavy spring, she said. The north grass comes up strong in June. There is a reliable creek on the eastern boundary that Thomas and I found once when we were scouting the area. She said Thomas's name without flinching, which he thought took a particular kind of courage. I appreciate the information, he said. The people in this county are generally good, she said. There is a man named Gerald Prout who runs the largest cattle concern in the area, and he has a habit of believing that gives him more authority than it does. Mostly he is harmless. Mostly. I have known men like that, Emmett said. Most places have them, she agreed. She finished her coffee and set the tin cup on the table with a precise click and stood up. "Thank you for the coffee," she said. "I am sorry for startling you this morning." "You did not especially startle me," he said, which was not entirely honest, but the spirit of it was. She almost smiled. It was the first time the possibility of a smile had crossed her face, and it changed the whole quality of it, the way light changes a landscape. "Good day, Mr. Winslow," she said. "Good day, Mrs. Bancroft," he said. He watched her wagon roll down the track toward the road and turn east, and he stood in the doorway a moment longer than was strictly necessary before he went back inside. That evening, sitting by the wood stove with one of his books open across his knee and not reading it, he thought about the particular quality of a woman who climbed onto a stranger's roof because the chimney needed fixing, and who drank her coffee black, and who spoke about her dead husband with sorrow and steadiness in equal measure, and who had eyes like October weather. He thought about it for longer than he had intended. The second encounter happened 6 days later in town. Harlan in October of 1878 was not a large place, but it was a functioning one, which was not nothing. There was the dry goods store, a blacksmith operated by a man named Cord who had come up from Texas 15 years before and showed no intention of going back, a small church that doubled as a school 3 days a week, a land office, a post office that was also the telegraph office, a feed store, a doctor's office whose occupant was a young man from Ohio named Dr. Hargrove who was earnest and competent, and a saloon called the Dusty Fork, which Emmett had visited twice for whiskey and neither time for trouble. He was at the feed store arranging the first delivery for his cattle when he heard a voice behind him that he recognized. "I need 40 pounds of oats and whatever you have left of the alfalfa mix." He turned. Edith Bancroft was standing at the counter with a list written on a folded piece of paper, in a wool coat the color of dried sage that she wore as if warmth were the only criterion by which clothing should be judged. A boy was standing beside her with his hands in his pockets and an expression of profound restlessness that suggested this errand had been going on longer than he considered appropriate. This was Calvin, evidently. He was a lean, dark-eyed boy with his mother's jaw and what appeared to be a permanent sunburn across his nose and cheeks. He was kicking one boot against the other in a rhythm that suggested time was passing too slowly for his particular temperament. Edith noticed Emmett before he had decided whether to speak, which settled the question. "Mr. Winslow," she said, not surprised. Not entirely not surprised either. "Mrs. Bancroft," he said. Calvin looked up at him with the frank, evaluating stare of a 9-year-old who had not yet learned to make that appraisal less visible. "Calvin," Edith said, with the mild warning note that parents learn to deploy like a tool, "this is Mr. Emmett Winslow. He has the Finley property. The one with the chimney," Calvin said. Emmett looked at Edith. Edith looked at Calvin with an expression that was long-suffering in a fond way. "Yes," Emmett said to the boy. "The one with the chimney." "Mama fixed it," Calvin said with the possessive pride of a child reporting something that reflected well on his household. "She is good at chimney work. She fixed our own 2 years ago. Papa showed her how, and then she did it herself because Papa hurt his shoulder." "I know," Emmett said. "I was there." Calvin regarded him with renewed interest. "Did you watch?" "I came up on the roof after a while," Emmett said. Calvin appeared to consider this an adequate response. "Did you need anything else from the feed store?" Edith asked him, and there was something slightly careful in the way she said it, careful in a way that had nothing to do with formality and everything to do with something she was not quite ready to put a name to. "I was about finished," he said. "We are going to the dry goods after this," Calvin announced. "Mama said I could have a peppermint stick if I did not complain about the wait at the post office, and I did not complain at all, which was very difficult." "Calvin," Edith said. "It is true," Calvin said with dignity. Emmett felt the smile come before he could organize a thought about whether to let it. It arrived on its own, and he saw Edith see it, and for a fraction of a second something in her face did what it had almost done on the roof, which was to let a smile happen, and this time it came fully through. It was a good smile, quiet and real and over quickly like a match struck in the wind. "Good day to you, Mr. Winslow," she said. "Good day," he said. "Enjoy your peppermint stick," he added to Calvin, who nodded with grave satisfaction. He walked out of the feed store and stood for a moment on the boardwalk in the October sun, with the plains wind coming through town, and a feeling in his chest that he recognized, after a moment, as the specific and inconvenient feeling of wanting to find a reason to stay where he was. He had not felt that in a long time. He bought tobacco he did not need and went home. It was Agnes Scaul who served as the primary architect of what happened next, though she would have described it simply as being neighborly, which was her explanation for everything she did that worked out well and everything she did that turned awkward. Agnes had known Edith since Thomas was alive, and had watched the 14 months of widowhood with the attentive concern of a woman who was fundamentally oriented toward other people's well-being as though it were a matter of personal responsibility. She was a round, warm, capable woman in her mid-40s with a husband, Heinrich, who was steady as a fence post and twice as quiet, and 4 children of her own ranging from 6 to 17, all of them well-fed and generally cheerful. She had heard from Martha Reeves about the new man at the Finley place. She had heard from the feed store owner, a gossipy man named Petter, that Emmett Winslow had stood talking to Edith Bancroft for rather longer than the transaction required. She had also heard from her eldest daughter, who had heard from a girl in town, that Mr. Winslow was said to be a serious and decent man with no notable vices and hands that said he knew how to work. Agnes Scaul organized a community supper. This was not unusual. The community supper was a regular event in Harlan County, held at the church roughly once every 6 weeks, and attended by most of the settled families in the area, because the plains were lonely in the way that flat open spaces are always lonely, and people needed to gather. Agnes organized many of them and saw no reason why this one should be any different in form, even if her motivations were somewhat more specifically arranged. She mentioned it to Edith on a Thursday when she came to collect Calvin after school. "I have spoken to Pastor Henley, and we will have the supper on Saturday the 26th, Agnes said, with the settled certainty of someone announcing weather. "You will bring your corn pudding." "I always bring my corn pudding," Edith said. "The new man from the Finley place will be invited as well," Agnes said, looking at her apron and smoothing a non-existent wrinkle. "It is proper to welcome a new neighbor." Edith looked at her. Agnes looked at her apron. "Agnes," Edith said. "It is only a supper," Agnes said. "I know what it is," Edith said. "I am simply observing that I know what it is." "Well," Agnes said, with the serenity of a woman whose intentions were entirely good, and who therefore felt no particular need to be self-conscious, "then we are all in agreement." Emmett Winslow received his invitation by way of a note delivered by Agnes's eldest son, a tall 17-year-old named Peter, who had been enlisted as a messenger with the promise of a piece of pie. Emmett read the note, which was written in a clear, practical hand, and invited him to supper at the church on Saturday the 26th, and mentioned that it would be a fine opportunity to meet his neighbors, and he thought about it for a day and a half before he decided to go. He told himself he was going because it was the right thing for a new man in a community to do. He chose his cleanest shirt, which was dark blue and had been pressed when he bought it in Missouri, and had survived the journey west with reasonable dignity. The church on Saturday night was warm with lamplight and loud with children, and laid out with enough food to suggest that the women of Harlan County took the occasion seriously. Long tables had been pushed together down the center of the room. A fiddler named Old George, who was perhaps 60 and possibly older and whose last name no one seemed to know, was already playing something lively near the door. Emmett came in and was immediately intercepted by a man he did not know who introduced himself with great efficiency as Harold Beckett, who ran the land office, and who began telling him about winter grazing strategies on the eastern Kansas plains, with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting for a new audience. Emmett listened politely and looked for Edith Bancroft across the room. He found her at one of the serving tables, spooning corn putting into a dish for an elderly man who seemed to be directing the distribution of his portion with significant specificity. She was wearing a dress he had not seen before, a dark red that made the lamplight catch in her hair, and she had her hair arranged differently, not the hard practical bun but something softer and more deliberate, and she was laughing at something the old man had said, a real laugh, open and brief, that he heard across the noise of the room. He realized he was staring. He returned his attention to Harold Beckett and the grazing strategies. It took him 15 minutes to be free of Beckett, who was a thoroughly good man but thorough in all his endeavors. By then the food was being properly laid out and people were beginning to seat themselves, and Agnes Scahl materialized at Emmett's elbow with the smooth inevitability of a woman who knows exactly where she is going to be and when, and she steered him without appearing to steer him toward a seat at the long table. The seat next to him was occupied, 2 minutes later, by Edith Bancroft, who sat down, looked at Agnes's retreating back, and then looked at Emmett with the expression of a woman who has been outmaneuvered by someone she loves too much to be properly annoyed at. "Mrs. Scahl is a force of nature," he said. "She is the most benevolently managing person I have ever known," Edith said. "She is also almost always right, which makes it impossible to object." He laughed, and she heard it, and for a moment they were simply two people sitting next to each other at a long table while the supper moved around them, easy in a way that surprised both of them. Calvin was seated further down the table with a group of other children, and appeared to have already formed a working alliance with two boys his age over some piece of business involving a dried corn cob that Edith pointedly did not investigate. The food was excellent. The corn pudding was Edith's, and he told her so, and she said she used a little less sugar than most because she thought sweetness should be modest, and he said he agreed with that principle more broadly, and she looked at him with those gray eyes in the lamplight, and he thought, well. They talked through most of the supper with the specific ease of two people who are both accustomed to competence and recognize it in each other, which is a particular kind of intimacy that does not require many words to establish. He told her about the cattle coming from Sumner County. She told him about the rhythm of the land around Harlan, what came when, which springs flooded and which creeks held through summer. He asked about Thomas's homestead, and she described it simply and without excessive sorrow, which he respected. After supper old George's fiddling turned more purposeful, and several of the younger families cleared space in the far end of the church for dancing, and Calvin appeared at Edith's elbow with the determined expression of a boy who has been coached. "Agnes said I should ask if you want to dance," Calvin announced to his mother. "Agnes should mind herself," Edith said. "She said you would say that," Calvin reported. Emmett stood up and offered his hand to Edith with a formality that was genuine rather than performative, because he was not a man who made gestures he did not mean. "Would you dance with me, Mrs. Bancroft?" he said. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She looked at Calvin, who was watching with the focused interest of a child who has been invested with a mission and wants to know how it will conclude. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He was not an elegant dancer, but he was a capable one, and she was better than he was, which he was not embarrassed by. They danced a reel with the other couples, and she was sure-footed and precise and laughed once at something that went slightly wrong, a quick, bright laugh, and he held it in his memory like a coin. Afterward, walking out for air on the church steps, the Kansas night cold and enormous around them, she said, "You are a serious person." "Is that an objection?" he said. "No," she said. "I am a serious person as well. I simply notice it." "I have had reason to be," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark plains. "So have I," she said. Calvin appeared in the doorway behind them, eating what appeared to be a second piece of pie. "Agnes said we could have second pie," he announced. "Of course she did," Edith said. The third time they spoke was Emmett's doing, which required something from him, the acknowledgement to himself that he was going deliberately rather than allowing circumstance to do the work. This felt important to recognize. His cattle arrived from Sumner County on the 29th of October, 8 head of mixed breeding that were healthy and solid, and exactly what he had paid for. The drovers who brought them up stayed a night in his barn and were gone by dawn, leaving him with the particular satisfaction of a man who has begun the concrete work of the life he has planned. He spent 3 days getting the fence lines right and the watering situation settled, and the barn organized for winter. On the 4th day, he baked a pan of corn bread with the recipe his mother had used in Missouri, which turned out reasonably well, and he rode over to the Bancroft homestead on the pretext of returning the bucket Edith had left at his property when she fixed the chimney. He had cleaned the bucket. He was aware of how transparent this was. The Bancroft homestead was 2 miles east, as she had said, a solid stone and frame house that sat on a slight rise with a view of the creek to the south. There was a kitchen garden laid out with the careful geometry of someone who grew food seriously. 2 chickens were doing something important in the yard. A dog of indeterminate age and considerable personality came out to investigate him with great thoroughness before deciding he was acceptable. Edith was at the woodpile. She was splitting logs with an axe, and she was good at it, the particular loose-wristed, controlled swing that people who have done it long enough learn, where the force comes from technique rather than brute effort. She was wearing a work coat and her hair was back in the practical bun, and she had not heard him ride up, and he had a moment of seeing her when she did not know she was being seen, which was always the truest picture. She was someone who worked, not as something imposed on her, but as something she was made of. There was a quality to the way she inhabited the world that was deeply, fundamentally capable, and he found it the most attractive thing he had encountered in years. He said her name. She turned, saw him, did not jump or startle, simply noted his presence with the equanimity of a person who does not frighten easily. "Mr. Winslow," she said. He held up the bucket. "You left this at my place," he said. She looked at the bucket. She looked at him. There was a quality to her gaze that said she understood perfectly what the bucket was and was not, and that she was deciding whether to acknowledge that. "Thank you for bringing it back," she said. "I made corn bread," he said. "I brought half of it." "That is very neighborly," she said, and set the axe in the chopping block with a clean, solid thunk and wiped her hands. She made coffee on the kitchen stove, and they sat at her kitchen table with the corn bread between them and the dog lying with enormous contentment under the table. And it was different from the church supper, which had been public and organized by Agnes. This was just 2 people at a table in a kitchen, with the wind outside and the stove crackling, and it was very quiet and very easy, which surprised him by degrees. She told him about Thomas's land claim, how they had come from Indiana in 1872, young and certain and a little afraid, though neither of them said so, and how the first winter had been hard in a way that the second winter was not, because by the second winter they knew what they were doing, and the house was properly sealed against the cold. She told him Thomas had been a man of great humor and great stubbornness, which were qualities she had found exhausting and essential in approximately equal measure, and that she missed him most in the evening when the house was quiet and Calvin was asleep, because Thomas had been good in the quiet. She said it without expectation of comfort, and Emmett did not offer comfort in a form she had not asked for. He said only that he thought the capacity to be good in the quiet was a rarer quality than people recognized, and she looked at him for a moment and said yes, she thought that was right. "What brought you out of Missouri?" she asked. "You said it felt like the right distance. That is not a complete explanation." He set down his coffee cup. He was a private man by long habit, and the habit was deep, but there was something about her directness that made deflection feel wrong in a way it usually did not. She was not prying. She was asking because she was genuinely interested, and she was not afraid of whatever the answer might be. "I was engaged to be married in Missouri," he said, 3 years ago. She changed her mind 6 weeks before the wedding. It was her right to do that. I do not hold it against her." He paused. but it is a particular kind of quiet thing to live through in a place where everyone knows you and most people have an opinion about what you should do next. Yes, Edith said. People's opinions about what one should do next are something I understand. I expect you do, he said. It is strange, she said thoughtfully, how loneliness and too many opinions from other people can exist at the same time. That is exactly how it is, he said. Calvin came in from wherever he had been, which appeared to be the barn based on the state of his boots, and stopped in the kitchen doorway to assess the situation with the frank interest of a child who has found an adult in his house and is deciding what to make of it. Is that corn bread? Calvin said. It is, Emmett said. Would you like some? Calvin looked at his mother, who nodded, and sat down at the table and ate 2 pieces with the focused pleasure of a boy for whom food is never casual and always serious. Are you going to come around here more? Calvin asked Emmett with the directness that 9-year-olds deployed without apology. Calvin, Edith said. I am asking because I want to know, Calvin said. Emmett looked at the boy and then at Edith and said, I expect I might, if your mother is agreeable. Edith held his gaze for a moment with those steady gray eyes, and then she said, quietly and without elaboration, I expect she might be. November came down hard and cold across the Kansas plains, the way it did in that country, with a seriousness that was not gradual but immediate, as though the land had made a decision overnight. The grass went straw-colored and the sky went iron gray, and the mornings had a bite that tasted of the months ahead. Emmett began building a proper shelf unit for his house, because the crates were impractical, and he had lumber from the mill in town, and he worked with wood well enough to do it properly. He was working on it in the evenings by lamplight when the cattle were settled, and he was making good progress. He was also finding reasons to be on the road that passed nearest to the Bancroft place, which he was not entirely honest with himself about, because the road he was on was not always the most direct route to wherever he was actually going. He helped her repair a fence section that had gone down in the first November wind, because he was passing, and because the fence needed repairing, and because she did not ask for help, which he had come to recognize as one of her reliable characteristics. He simply stopped his horse and climbed down and picked up the wire stretcher end, and they worked either side of the down section without much talk and fixed it in 40 minutes. When they were done, she said, Thank you, directly and without excessive decoration. He said, You are welcome, the same way. And they stood by the fence in the cold November air and looked at each other for a moment in which something was acknowledged without being named, and then he rode on. Gerald Prout was exactly what Edith had described him as, which was a man who had acquired a measure of prosperity and confused it with authority. He was in his mid-50s, heavy through the gut, with a mustache he was proud of and an opinion about everything in Harlan County that he shared freely and without invitation. Emmett had met him at the church supper and formed an assessment he had kept to himself. Prout had looked at the Finley property with a particular acquisitive expression when they were introduced, and he had said, with the good humor of a man accustomed to having his good humor received as a gift, I had my eye on that land myself. Well, you have it now, as though this were an adequate conclusion to the subject. The issue with Prout became real in mid-November when his hired hands came to Emmett and said the north boundary of the Finley property, which was now Emmett's property, had been moved sometime in the recent past by what appeared to be a deliberate repositioning of the boundary stakes. The repositioning had moved roughly 20 acres of the north pasture, which Edith had correctly identified as the best grass in the area, across into what Prout was operating as his southern range. Emmett rode out and looked at it carefully. He found the old stake holes in the earth, frozen over but still visible if you knew how to look, and they were not where the current stakes were. Someone had moved them 20 feet north. He went to the land office. Harold Beckett, who had a great deal of enthusiasm about grazing strategies and an equal degree of precision about land records, pulled the original filing documents and confirmed what Emmett had already known. The boundary had been moved. The original recorded line gave Emmett those 20 acres. Has this happened before on Prout's boundaries? Emmett asked. Beckett was quiet for a moment longer than the question required. I believe there have been some disputes, he said carefully. Emmett went to see Prout. He went alone, and in the morning when his head was clear and his intentions were specific. To have the boundary restored without violence and without extended legal entanglement. Because both options cost time and money he had better uses for. Prout received him in his main house, which was the largest private house in the county, and furnished in a way that suggested Prout had money and wanted that to be clearly understood. He was affable and dismissive in the same breath, which was a skill some men cultivated and Emmett did not admire. I think you will find, Prout said, with the ease of a man who expects his version of things to be accepted, that the boundaries have always been roughly as they are. Survey work out here is not always precise, as I am sure you understand. The land office records are precise, Emmett said. The original filing is clear. The stakes were moved after filing. That is a serious accusation, Prout said, dropping the affability by 1 degree. It is an observation, Emmett said. I would like the stakes moved back to the recorded positions. And if I disagree about the interpretation, then I will pursue it through the proper legal channels, Emmett said, which will mean the land records are examined by the county surveyor and by whatever legal authority the land office calls in, and everyone in Harlan County will be watching. There was a long pause. Prout was a man who ran on the assumption that new arrivals could be managed, that they would be impressed by his establishment and uncertain of their ground. He had clearly not accounted for Emmett Winslow, who was neither impressed nor uncertain, and who had the specific stillness of a man who had decided what he was going to do and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. The stakes will be moved, Prout said, in the tone of a man conceding a point he has decided costs him less than the alternative. Good, Emmett said. I appreciate your cooperation. He rode back through the cold November afternoon and turned at the junction toward the Bancroft homestead because he wanted to tell her, which was a new thing, wanting to tell someone something, and he did not examine it too carefully. She was on the porch shelling the last of her dried beans when he rode up, and she looked up with her hand still working in the bowl and listened while he told her what had happened, watching his face. You handled that well, she said. He will try something else eventually, Emmett said. Men like that do not simply stop. No, she agreed. But now he knows you are not easy to move. She paused in the bean shelling. That matters here. I have dealt with men like him before, he said. I know, she said. And then, with a look that was direct in the way she was always direct, it matters, knowing you are next door. It was not a declaration. It was simply something true said plainly, which was her way. But the weight of it landed in him the way simple true things do, which is heavily and with duration. It matters to me as well, he said, the knowing. She held his gaze for a moment. Will you come in for supper, she said. I have a rabbit stew and there is more than enough. Yes, he said, thank you. Calvin was doing his schoolwork at the kitchen table when they came in, and he looked up at Emmett with the settled recognition of someone whose working theory about the situation was being confirmed. And he went back to his work with the air of a boy who is pleased with his own perceptiveness. December in Harlan County was a test that the land applied to everyone living on it, and the test was whether you had prepared well enough and could endure what you could not prepare for. The first real blizzard came on the 8th and lasted 2 days, laying 3 feet of snow across the plains and drifting against every building like something with intent. Emmett's cattle were in the barn and fed, and the house was sealed, and he had enough wood and food to be comfortable. And he was, except for the quality of the aloneness, which was different now than it had been in Missouri, not better exactly but more specific, more about one particular absence than the general one. He thought about Edith and Calvin in their stone house on the rise, and he knew from her description that the house was solid and she had prepared well, and he knew she was capable, and he still thought about them through the blizzard with a quality of attention that was new. On the 3rd day, when the storm had dropped to a hard, cold stillness, and the snow was deep but passable, he saddled his horse and rode the 2 miles east. She came out onto the porch when she heard the horse, and she was standing in the cold with her arms crossed over her coat looking at him with an expression that was mostly composed and contained within it, barely detectable, something that was relief. "You did not have to come," she said. "I know," he said. "Are you both well?" "We are well," she said. "Come in out of the cold." Calvin had been using the blizzard as an excuse to avoid all schoolwork and was building something elaborate with a set of carved wooden blocks on the kitchen floor. He looked up at Emmett with the unguarded pleasure of a boy whose world has just expanded in a way he approves of. "Can you play checkers?" Calvin asked. "I can," Emmett said. They played 3 games of checkers, which Calvin won twice with the fierce concentration of a child who plays to win, and Emmett won once fair and square to Calvin's theatrical outrage. Edith sat near the stove with her mending and watched them with a quality of stillness that was different from her usual stillness. It was quieter, more at ease. After Calvin was sent to bed, which required the negotiation of a 4th game of checkers that Edith declined on the grounds that it was already past 8 o'clock, and tomorrow was a school day even if the snow was high, Emmett and Edith sat in the kitchen with tea she had made from dried herbs she grew herself, and the stove was warm, and the snow outside the window was a blue-white brightness in the moonlight. "He likes you," she said. "I like him," Emmett said. "He is a good boy." "He is," she said, with the particular quiet warmth of a mother who agrees completely. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "He has not had a man around much since Thomas. Agnes's husband Heinrich is kind to him, but he is not a man of many words." "Thomas sounds like he was a man of many words," Emmett said. "A great many," she said and smiled, and this time the smile did not go away quickly. It stayed, small and warm and real. He could fill a room with conversation the way other men fill a room with furniture, everywhere at once and all of it somehow useful. "I am not much like that," Emmett said. "No," she agreed. "But you are present, which is its own kind of filling a room." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight and the tea steam and the specific intimacy of 2 people alone in a warm kitchen in the middle of a winter night, and he thought, "I am in love with this woman." He thought it the way you think a thing that you have known for a while but have not yet put in the specific words, and once the words are there they change the quality of everything that came before, illuminating it backwards. He did not say it. It was December and they had known each other 8 weeks, and she was a woman who had been a wife, and was now something harder and more self-determined than that, and the saying of it required her to be ready for it, not only him. But he held it in himself for the rest of the evening like something warm. He stayed later than he intended, because the conversation was easy and the night was cold and neither of them was in a hurry, and when he finally stood to go, she walked him to the door and they stood in the open doorway for a moment with the cold air between them and the lamps behind her making her a silhouette. "Be careful on the road," she said. "I will be," he said. "I will come by in a few days to check the north fence. The snow will have put weight on the posts. I would appreciate that," she said. And then in the precise measured voice she used for things she had decided to say after careful thought, "I am glad you came, Emmett." First name. His first name in her mouth, and the way she said it was neither casual nor dramatic, just true, just the specific weight of using a person's name when you mean it. "So am I," he said. "Edith." He rode home through the moonlit snow with his breath making clouds in the cold air, and the plains immense, and still around him, and the particular aliveness of a man who is paying very close attention to his life. Christmas in Harlan County was a modest affair by some standards and a generous one by others, which was the way of frontier communities that had learned to make much of what they had. The church had a service, and a small pageant in which Calvin played a shepherd with the exact level of dignity he considered appropriate for the role, which was considerable. Agnes Scaul organized a gathering at her house the day after Christmas to which the whole neighborhood was invited, and there was music and food, and the warm noise of people who had survived another season together. Emmett came and Edith came, and they sat near each other through most of the evening without it being arranged, simply because that was where they each ended up, and people noticed, and opinions were formed, and for once the opinions being formed were the kind that Agnes Scahl approved of. In January, when the cold was at its deepest and the days were short, and the work contracted to the essentials of survival and nothing more, Emmett rode to the Bancroft place one Sunday afternoon and asked Edith if she would walk with him to the creek. She said yes, and put on her wool coat and her warmest boots, and they walked down through the frozen grass and the bare cottonwoods to the creek, which was running low and clear between its ice-fringed banks, and they walked along it for a while saying things that were not important, and saying nothing, and both were equally comfortable. He stopped at a bend in the creek where the water ran over a flat shelf of limestone and made a sound that was constant and pleasant, and he turned to face her. She was looking at him already with those October eyes. "I want to say something to you," he said, "that I have been considering for a while." "All right," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. He said it with the same directness she used for things that were simply true and could be said plainly. "I do not need you to say anything back right now, because I understand that this is not a simple thing for you, and I have no wish to put pressure on it. I wanted you to know because I think you deserve to know, and because I am not a man who is comfortable with important things being unsaid." She was quiet for a moment. The creek ran over its limestone shelf. A crow called somewhere in the cottonwoods. "When Thomas died," she said slowly, in the voice she used for things she had thought about very carefully, "I told myself that the part of me that could love someone was finished being used, not from bitterness, just from exhaustion and from the particular arithmetic of loss." She paused. "I was wrong about that." He waited. "I have been in love with you since approximately the moment you climbed up on that roof," she said, which surprised me considerably because I had gone up there to fix a chimney and not to find anything else. He looked at her. She looked at him, steady and clear and certain. He took her face in both hands, which were large and calloused and gentle, and kissed her with the care of a man who understands the value of what he is holding. She kissed him back with the full presence of a woman who has decided, and Edith Bancroft did nothing by halves. The creek ran, and the crow called, and the January cold pressed around them, and neither of them noticed it. They walked back up through the frozen grass hand in hand, which felt like the most natural thing in the world and also entirely new, and at the door of her house she said, "Come to supper on Sunday, all the Sundays." "All of them," he agreed. February brought more snow and also something that had been coming for a while, which was that the community had formed its opinions about Emmett Winslow and Edith Bancroft, and most of those opinions were warm and glad. Agnes Scahl had predicted the whole development with the satisfaction of someone who has seen it coming and helped set the table, and she was not at all modest about it. The exception, as Edith had predicted, was Gerald Prout, who made a comment in the Dusty Fork Saloon one February evening that was heard by 3 men and made its way around the county in 2 days, as comments in small communities do. The comment was the sort that questioned the respectability of a widow who was seeing a man she was not married to, phrased in the particular way that such comments are phrased when the speaker wants the damage without the accountability. Emmett heard about it on a Thursday. He was at the blacksmith's in Cord, who had no patience for insinuation, told him directly because he thought Emmett deserved to know, and because he trusted Emmett's judgment about what to do with it. Emmett's first feeling was a cold anger that he held very still while he thought about it. His second thought was about Edith, who had survived 14 months of other people's opinions and had her own very clear view of what she owed them, which was nothing. He did not go to confront Prout. He went to the Bancroft homestead. Edith was in her kitchen making bread when he came in, and she read something in his face immediately and set down the dough. He told her what Prout had said. She was quiet for a moment. Her hands, dusted with flour, rested flat on the table. "I heard something similar already," she said. "Martha Reeves told me this morning." "I want to address it," he said. "What does that mean?" she said. He looked at her carefully. "It means that I would like if you are willing to ask you to marry me, not because of Prout. He does not factor into this except that he gave me occasion to say sooner what I was intending to say eventually." He paused. "I love you. I want to spend my life on the farm next to yours. I want to be here for Calvin. I want to build something with you that is ours. That is what I mean." She was still for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes. Just yes." Clear and direct and without ceremony, which was exactly what he had hoped for because it was exactly who she was. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and she came to meet him, flour on her hands and all, and he held her with the full weight of everything he intended, and she held him back the same way. "Calvin is going to be very pleased with himself," she said into his shoulder. "He will be insufferable about it," Emmett said. "He will be magnificent about it," she said, and pulled back to look at him, and her eyes were bright and her smile was the open, real one, and he thought he would carry this particular moment for the rest of his life without any effort at all. They told Calvin that evening. Calvin received the information with the focused intensity of a boy processing something very important. Looked at Emmett for a long time. "You will live here," he said. "If you are agreeable," Emmett said. "We will work out the details of the farms together, but yes, this is your home. I would come here." "What will I call you?" Calvin asked. "That is entirely your choice," Emmett said. "Whatever feels right to you is right." Calvin thought about it with great seriousness for almost a full minute. "I will think about it," he said with the dignity of someone who takes nomenclature seriously. "Fair enough," Emmett said. That evening when Edith was washing the supper dishes and Emmett was drying them, a domestic partnership that had arrived naturally and felt like it had been going on for years, Calvin appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt with his bare feet on the cold floor. "Emmett," he said. They both looked at him. "That is what I will call you," he said. "Just Emmett." And then, with a great deal of meaning packed into a small space, "For now." Emmett felt something happen in his chest that he was not prepared for and was grateful for the dish towel to occupy his hands. "That is exactly right," he said. They were married in March of 1879, on a Saturday when the first green was just beginning to show in the Kansas grass, the kind of green that looks tentative from a distance and is absolutely certain up close. The ceremony was at the church with Pastor Henley officiating, and the whole county came because that was what you did when one of your own people found happiness. You came and bore witness and ate the food afterward. Agnes Scaul cried at the appropriate moments and several that were not appointed for the purpose. Old George played something quietly beautiful on his fiddle, while Edith walked up the aisle in a dress of blue-gray wool that she had made herself, and wore with the authority of a woman who knows exactly who she is and has dressed accordingly. Emmett watched her come down the aisle and felt the full weight and the full rightness of what was happening with equal intensity. Calvin stood beside him as his best man, a position he had accepted with the gravity of a senior official. He was wearing his good boots, and his hair had been combed to within an inch of its life. He stood very straight and handed Emmett the ring at the correct moment with flawless precision and the concentrated satisfaction of someone who has rehearsed. The ring was one Emmett had commissioned from a silversmith passing through Harlan in February, a simple band of silver with a small turquoise stone set in it, because Edith had mentioned once that she thought turquoise was beautiful, and he had filed it away. When he slipped it onto her finger, she looked down at it for a moment and then up at him with an expression that was everything. "With all that I am," he said, which was the vow he had written himself. "With everything I have built and everything still building," she said, which was hers. The congregation was very quiet for a moment, in the specific way of people who are genuinely moved. Then Agnes Scaul made a sound that was unmistakably a sob dressed as a cough, and the congregation laughed, and Emmett kissed his wife in the March sunlight with the green coming up outside, and the fiddle starting and Calvin standing beside them both like a small official endorsement. The spring and summer of 1879 were the building time, and Emmett and Edith approached it the way they approached everything, which was with both of them fully present and neither of them wasting effort. They kept both properties working. Emmett's land had the better north pasture for the cattle, and Edith's had the better creek access and the established kitchen garden, and they moved between the two farms with the practical flexibility of people who understood that the point was the work, not the formality. Emmett moved his main living to the Bancroft house because it was the larger and more established, and because this was Calvin's home, and that mattered. He kept his own house as a second building for storage and eventually, he thought, for other uses. He added 12 head of cattle through the spring, buying carefully from sources he had checked thoroughly. Edith expanded the kitchen garden to include a medicinal herb section that she supplied to Dr. Hargrove, which brought in a small but consistent income that she was satisfied with. She was teaching Calvin his mathematics and letters herself on the days the school was not in session, because she had the education and the patience and the conviction that Calvin's mind deserved consistent attention. Calvin had begun calling Emmett Pa in early April, which he did without announcement one morning at breakfast, as though it had been the case for a while, and he was simply using the correct word at last. Emmett had looked up from his eggs and found he had nothing useful to say, and Edith had found something very interesting to do with her coffee cup, and after a moment the breakfast continued, and nothing more was said about it, because sometimes the most important things are the ones that happen quietly. The issue with Prout came to a final resolution in July. Prout had not given up on the north pasture, and had been making small encroachments over the spring, moving water troughs and grazing his cattle increasingly close to the boundary. Emmett had documented each incident carefully because he was a careful man, and in June he brought the documentation to the land office and then to the county judge, a man named Harwood who was deliberate and fair. The hearing was brief and unambiguous. Beckett presented the land records. Emmett presented the documented encroachments. Prout's lawyer made arguments that the judge heard with polite patience and did not find compelling. The ruling was clear. The boundaries were to be respected as recorded. Prout was assessed a small fine for the documented encroachments, and a formal survey was ordered at Prout's expense. Prout walked out of the courthouse with the expression of a man who had found the edge of his own influence and did not enjoy the view. He did not bother the Winslow property again. Emmett came home from the courthouse to find Edith in the kitchen making supper with the calm efficiency she applied to everything, and she looked up when he came in and read the outcome in his face. "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed. He hung up his hat and jacket and washed his hands and came to help her set the table, and Calvin came in from the barn with the particular energy of a boy who has been outdoors all day and is now ready for supper, and the three of them sat down to eat in the July evening with the windows open and the smell of the prairie grass coming in on the warm air. It was, Emmett thought, exactly what he had come west to find. In September, Edith told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning, in the kitchen, in the same direct, plain way she told him everything, standing across the table from him with her hands flat on the wood and her gray eyes clear, and something in her face that was joy held with great care. The way you hold something you know is fragile and precious. He came around the table and took her in his arms and held her for a long time, and she let him, her cheek against his shoulder and her hands holding the back of his shirt, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed to be said. Then she said into his shoulder, "I want you to know that I am happy, truly, not complicated about it, just happy." "So am I," he said. "So am I," they told Calvin at supper that evening. Calvin received the information with a gravity appropriate to the occasion, thought about it for a full 2 minutes, and then said, "I would like a brother, but I will be equally responsible in either case." "That is very mature of you," Edith said. "I am going to be 10 in 3 weeks, Calvin said, with the authority of a person on the verge of a significant decade. The baby came in April of 1880. In the same week the first cottonwoods put out their small furled leaves along the creek, and it was a boy. Dr. Hargrove came out from town and Agnes Scawl was there, and Emmett was downstairs doing the things a man does when he is trying to be useful, and knows that the useful thing is to wait, which is to make coffee and carry water and be available and try not to think too hard about what is happening above his head. Calvin sat beside him on the porch steps in the cold April night, and they said very little to each other, and both of them were grateful for the other's company. When Hargrove came to the top of the stairs and called down that all was well and Emmett could come up, Calvin stayed on the steps with the decision of a 10-year-old, who understands that some moments belong to other people first. Edith was propped against the pillows with the exhausted, luminous quality of a woman who has just done the hardest work there is, and she was holding a wrapped bundle against her chest, and she looked up when Emmett came in with the smile that was the open, real one, the one he had first seen at the church supper. "Come and meet your son," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the bundle in his arms with the careful transfer of something irreplaceable, and he held his son for the first time, and looked down at the small red face, and the dark down of hair, and the absolute certainty of the small fists clenched against his chest. Something in him that he had not known was held arrived in a place it had been trying to reach for a long time. "He is perfect," he said, which was not remarkable or original, but was completely true. "He is," Edith agreed. "I have been thinking about names." "I thought you might have," he said. "Thomas Emmett Winslow," she said, watching his face. He looked at her. She held his gaze with the calm certainty of a woman who has thought about this carefully and arrived at something that is right from every direction. "Thomas first," she said, "because he deserves to be carried forward, and Emmett in the middle because you are the man who is here and you are the man this boy will grow up knowing." He could not speak for a moment. He looked down at the boy in his arms. "Thomas Emmett," he said quietly. "Tom," Edith said, "when he is old enough to have a preference." Calvin came upstairs eventually, having waited with the patience of a 10-year-old exercising enormous restraint, and he stood beside the bed and looked at his brother with an expression that was awed and possessive and already in love. "He is very small," Calvin said. "You were smaller," Edith said. "I find that difficult to believe," Calvin said. Emmett caught his wife's eye over Calvin's head, and she was laughing quietly, and he was laughing, and young Tom Winslow slept in his father's arms completely undisturbed by any of it. The years that followed were the years that people mean when they say they built something, the incremental accumulation of a life that fits, the slow deepening of love into something that is not less passionate but is more solid, which is not a contradiction, but rather what passion becomes when it is sustained. Emmett's herd grew steadily. By 1882, he had 40 head of good cattle and a reputation in the county for honest dealing that brought him buyers from 2 counties over. Edith's herb and kitchen garden had grown into a significant enterprise, and she supplied Dr. Hargrove regularly and had begun a correspondence with a botanist in Topeka who was interested in her notes on medicinal plants of the Kansas plains. Calvin grew into a long, lean young man with his mother's jaw and his own particular quality of fierce intelligence. At 12, he was reading everything he could find. At 14, he had decided to be a lawyer, a decision that showed every sign of being permanent, and Emmett and Edith had begun discussing the question of education in the serious way they discussed everything important, which was directly and thoroughly, and without pretending the questions were easier than they were. Tom grew into a solid, cheerful boy who was nothing like his parents in temperament, being primarily interested in the physical world and in animals, and in being outdoors as much as possible, which Emmett recognized as a quality of his own younger self and found deeply endearing. In the winter of 1883, when Tom was almost 3 and Calvin was 14, Edith told Emmett that she was expecting again. She told him the same way she had told him the first time, across the kitchen table in the morning with her hands flat on the wood and her gray eyes clear. He came around the table and held her the same way. "Happy," he said into her hair. "Entirely," she said. This one was a girl, Born in August of 1884 on a hot morning with the prairie cicadas singing in the grass outside. They named her Clara Me Winslow, Clara for Emmett's mother in Missouri and me, because Edith said it had a lightness to it that felt right for a summer child. Calvin, who was 15 by then and had developed a considerably more sophisticated demeanor than he had at 10, looked at his baby sister with an expression of such unguarded tenderness that Edith had to look away to compose herself. "She is extraordinary," Calvin said, with the conviction of someone stating something obvious. "She is," Emmett agreed. Tom stood on his tiptoes to look over Calvin's arm at the baby and said, "Is she going to cry a lot?" "Some," Edith said. Tom appeared to file this away as an acceptable arrangement. The years of those children growing were full years, the kind that are tiring and rich in equal measure, the kind that make you tired in the evenings in a way that is entirely satisfying. Emmett worked the cattle and the land with the steady commitment of a man who understands that the work is the point, and the life, not something separate from it. Edith ran the household and the garden and the herb enterprise, and taught her children and assisted Dr. Hargrove when he needed a second set of careful hands, which he increasingly did. They were partners in every sense of the word, which was the thing Emmett had not known he was looking for until he found it. Not a woman to be protected or arranged for, but a woman to work beside, to think with, to disagree with productively when the disagreements came, which they did, because they were both serious people with firm opinions, and firm opinions occasionally went in different directions. The disagreements they had were good disagreements, the kind that end with both people having thought more carefully and arrived somewhere better than either had started. They were never about fundamental things, because on the fundamental things they were in the same place, had been from nearly the beginning. On an evening in the autumn of 1885, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch in the October dark with their coffee, the way they did most evenings when the work was done, and the plains were enormous and still around them with the first star visible and the grass silver in the early moonlight. "Do you remember the day you came up on the roof?" Edith said. "I remember everything about that morning," he said. "I was so annoyed," she said, with the fond amusement of looking back at something from a comfortable distance. "I thought you were going to make me come down before I was finished. I thought you were going to tell me what was wrong with my own chimney and then climb down and drive away," he said. "I did tell you what was wrong with your chimney," she said. "You also told me about the south pasture flooding in spring," he said, "which I have been grateful for every year since." "Practical information," she said. "Everything about you is practical," he said, "and everything about you is beautiful, and I have never found those things to be in competition." She looked at him sideways, with the lamplight from inside catching her face and her hair, and she was 40 years old, and she was more beautiful to him than she had been at 32 on a stranger's roof with mortar on her hands, which he would not have thought possible that morning if you had asked him to predict it. "You are getting sentimental in your middle years," she said. "Occasionally," he agreed. She reached over and took his hand on the arm of the chair, her calloused practical fingers lacing through his, and they sat that way in the October dark, with the stars coming out one by one over the Kansas plains. The plains that had swallowed so many people's dreams had not swallowed theirs. They had learned the land, and the land had given them something in return. Not ease exactly, but solidity, the deep-rootedness of people who have chosen where they stand and stand there fully. Calvin had gone to Topeka for his schooling by 1886, with the gravity and the determination of a young man who knows what he wants to do with his life and has the intelligence and the stubbornness to do it. He wrote letters home every 2 weeks, long detailed letters in the clear hand his mother had taught him, and he always asked after the cattle and after Tom and after little Clara, and he always closed with the same line, "Take care of each other," which was what Emmett had said to him the morning he left, and Calvin had carried it back as something to give. Tom at 7 was everything his father had hoped for in terms of sheer vitality, a solid outdoor child with an absolute devotion to the horses, and a gift for the cattle work that Emmett had recognized early and was quietly proud of. Tom would have the land when the time came. It was something Emmett knew without having yet said it, the way you know the important true things before you put them into words. Clara, too, was, as Calvin had predicted, extraordinary, and also, as Tom had predicted, sometimes loud, and she was entirely herself in the specific way that second daughters often are, watching everything with dark, bright eyes that had gotten the gray from her mother and some quality underneath it that was purely her own. One Sunday morning in November of 1886, Emmett woke before dawn to the smell of biscuits, which was the specific smell of his particular happiness, and he lay still for a moment in the warm dark listening to the sounds of the house, the stove crackling from the kitchen, the wind outside with its familiar plains voice, Tom asleep in the next room, Clara in the crib near the far wall. Edith was already up, which was not unusual. She had a relationship with the early morning that he respected but did not share. She did her clearest thinking before the household woke. He got up and dressed and went to the kitchen, and she was at the stove with her hair down because she had not yet put it up, and the biscuits were in the Dutch oven and there was coffee on, and she was reading something from a folded paper that she set down when he came in. "Letter from Calvin?" he asked, going to pour the coffee. "Arrived yesterday," she said. "He has been offered a position as a clerk in a law firm in Topeka to begin in January, while he completes his studies." "Good," Emmett said. "That is what he wanted. He is so much himself," she said, with the smile that was reserved entirely for her children and was different from all her other smiles. "He learned that from you," Emmett said. She looked at him over her coffee cup. "He is stubbornly determined and direct to the point of occasionally startling people," she said. "I cannot imagine where he got that from." "From his mother," Emmett said, "who climbed onto a stranger's roof without announcement and fixed his chimney and told him to come up if he wanted to understand what she was doing." She laughed, the open full laugh, the one he loved best, and the kitchen was warm and the biscuits smelled of home, and Clara made a sound from the other room that indicated she was awake and requesting attendance, and Tom's feet hit the floor with the particular thump of a 7-year-old, who is never in doubt about the direction of his movement. Emmett went to get Clara and brought her to the kitchen on his hip, her dark hair wild from sleep, her expression one of deep mourning grievance at the state of the world, and Edith took her and held her against her shoulder, and Clara settled immediately with the absolute trust of a small child who knows exactly where she is safe. Tom arrived in the kitchen already talking about something he had planned for the horses, a proposal he was presenting with the methodical detail of a boy who had learned that his father responded well to evidence. And Emmett sat down at the kitchen table and listened with full attention and offered his assessment, and Tom modified his plan accordingly with good grace. Outside, the November morning was coming up cold and clear, the plains going from gray to gold as the sun climbed, the cattle moving in the north pasture against the skyline, the cottonwoods along the creek bare and silver. It was, as it had been for years now, his life. Not the life he had imagined in Missouri, not the one he had planned before the woman who changed her mind 6 weeks before the wedding, not the one he had ridden west with when he was 36 and quiet with old disappointment. It was better than any of those. It was better in all the ways that matter, which are the ways you cannot plan for. He looked at Edith across the kitchen, who was rocking Clara and listening to Tom's revised horse plan with the particular combination of real attention and suppressed amusement that she brought to everything their children did, and she felt his eyes and looked up, and for a moment it was just the two of them the way it sometimes was even in a full room, the private exchange of two people who have built something real together and know it. She looked at him with her gray eyes and the quiet warmth that had replaced the careful steady against grief of those first weeks, and she smiled, just a small one just for him, and he smiled back. In the spring of 1887, when the grass came green and fast up the slopes of the Winslow homestead, and the creek ran full and bright from the spring melt. Emmett climbed up on his own roof to check the chimney. The mortar that Edith had put there in October of 1878 had held through 9 Kansas winters with a few small touch-ups, a testament to the quality of the work done by a woman who did not do things halfway. But there were new sections now that needed attention, the natural wear of stone and mortar over time, and he was on the south slope with his bucket and trowel working steadily. He heard footsteps on the ladder. He looked over. Edith came up over the eave with her bucket and her trowel, her rubber-soled boots sure on the shingles, her gray-threaded hair back in the bun she still wore for work, her gray eyes finding him immediately with the expression she had on the roof 8.5 years ago, focused and present and entirely in her own authority. She crossed the roof to where he was working and crouched beside him and looked at the south flashing. "You missed a section there," she said. "I was getting to it," he said. "I can do the north side while you finish here," she said, and opened her own bucket. They worked side by side in the spring morning, the sky enormous and blue above them, the plains rolling out in every direction, the new grass bright on every slope. Below them, Tom was moving one of the horses in the paddock with the easy authority of a child born to it. Clara was toddling with great determination around the kitchen garden, supervised at a distance by the old dog who had appointed himself her guardian with the seriousness of a sworn duty. Emmett worked beside his wife on the south slope of their roof with the morning light on her face and the smell of fresh mortar and the sound of the plains all around, and he thought about the morning she had come up on his roof a stranger, and how he had stood at the base of his own house and looked up at her and said, "Come down," and she had said, "Come up." He had come up. He had not come down from anything worth coming down from since. "There," Edith said, smoothing the last of the flashing with her trowel, and sat back on her heels to look at the work with the critical satisfaction of a person inspecting something done correctly. "Good," he said. She looked at him sideways, with the particular quality of attention she had always given him, the direct considering gaze of a woman who saw things clearly and was not afraid of what she saw. "Good," she agreed. They sat for a moment on the ridge of their own roof in the spring morning, high enough to see the full sweep of the country they had made into theirs, the pastures and the garden and the creek going silver to the east, and the road running west into a horizon that was infinite and blue and full of ordinary beautiful days. He took her hand. She held it. Below them, Calvin's most recent letter sat on the kitchen table, full of news from Topeka, and Tom's voice carried up from the paddock in the particular high, bright tenor of a boy in the middle of something he loved, and Clara had found something in the kitchen garden that she considered significant and was reporting it to the dog with great emphasis. The chimney was fixed. The house was sound. The land was theirs. The family they had made, out of loss and possibility, and a morning when a stubborn woman climbed onto a stranger's roof because it needed doing, was here and alive and loud and growing. Emmett Winslow sat on his roof with his wife's hand in his and the Kansas spring all around them and thought, with the full quiet certainty of a man who has come to the right place at last, "This is it. This is exactly it." And Edith Bancroft Winslow, who had climbed onto a stranger's roof with a bucket of mortar and no intention beyond the work, sat beside the man she had built a life with and felt the spring wind and his hand in hers and the sounds of her children below and thought, "Yes. This is what I built. This is what I came up here to find."